we're going to leave it on that note, as it were, no pun, as Tom is now here. So I'm going to hand over to Tom and look forward very much to hearing what he's got to say to us. So thank you all. I'll hand over.
Thanks, David, and sorry about the little hiatus. Thanks for being so patient. From Berlin today. And I was doing a rehearsal a week ago on Zoom, and we had a huge excitement. There were huge explosions outside and bangs and shouting, and then much goings on. And I thought maybe this could be it. This could be my last moments live on Zoom. While I was rehearsing, I explained exactly what I wanted at my funeral and everything. So it was all great, all set up well. And it turns out that the police had been looking for this awful thing that's been happening in Germany. There was a guy sending very threatening, horrible right-wing emails, like neo-Nazi emails for the last 2 years, and they've been trying to catch him. Anyway, he lived in the flat just above us. And this was the massive police raid, which was then on the news the next day. Anyway, we calmly carried on with our rehearsal in the traditional English manner. And it was all fine, but it was very exciting. So I can't guarantee excitement at that level, but just to say anything can happen. Thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely to be here with you this evening. And I'll get right on with it and just say a little bit about what tonight's session is and actually also what it isn't. So it's a journey through the development of Western music, mainly in the Western Christian choral tradition, which is, of course, the basis of most of what we do as a choir. It's certainly not the only tradition that was going on. And in many ways, we were in the west of Europe behind the times compared with the Byzantine tradition, some of the Jewish tradition, in terms of the development of vocal music and also in terms of writing it down. But nonetheless, it's the tradition that we're, as it were, in. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on. And interestingly, it's a story of the development of musical styles, but also then gradually this element of notation and writing it, how we actually wrote down music. And of course, both these elements feed into one another. So as music develops, it requires to be written down in certain ways that are increasingly complex. And as we develop ways of writing it down, that in turn influences the sort of music we can actually dream up, since we're going beyond, for instance, just improvised music. So it's a cross-fertilization, and I hope to give you a little bit of an impression of how that actually worked. For those of you who are musicologists, historians, theologians, etc., there will be all sorts of places where you probably cringe as I whiz through centuries at a time and skate over all sorts of inconsistencies and so on. But really my aim is to give you a sense of the sweep of the story and of the history. So we'll get right away and we'll do some singing. Now David's warmed you up so brilliantly. I'm just going to sing something. It'll probably be quite familiar. It's a plain song of the Agnus Dei in the Mass for the Dead, the Requiem Mass. And I'm just going to sing a little phrase and you're going to sing it back to me. You can stay muted, but sing it, properly and sit up and make sure everything's working and make a really lovely sound. And yeah, just answer me with each phrase. So here we go. Agnus Dei, your turn. Qui tollis peccata mundi. Dona eis requiem. Fantastic. Now I've got to try that again. That's screen sharing because I did it wrong. Okay. Now you should be able to see. Thumbs up if you can see my screen now. Great. Fantastic. So what we just did is really what monks and nuns all over Europe were doing for centuries. In other words, they were learning plain chant for the services in their church, their monastery, their abbey, whatever it may be. And they were doing it by ear. And there they are, they're following the words, but the musical sides of things, they're learning. And it took probably 10 years or so for somebody to learn all the chants, all the different settings that they would need to do their daily course through the church year, which of course is a huge outlay in terms of time and energy. And the other thing that was important was that it meant that traditions were very much local. People were doing what they did in their own monastery, in their own little corner of Europe. And there were as many traditions as there were places. Now, as you know, churches, centralized churches, like things to be ordered, and they like to have control, generally speaking, for all sorts of reasons. And the story is, whether it's actually the case, we'll see in a second, but the story is that Pope Gregory, one of his great contributions was to say, look, this won't do having such a diversity of what's going on. We're supposed to be one church, and we should be worshiping God in the same way. So he called on the Holy Spirit to dictate a definitive version of all the plain chants. And that this was then written down, and you can see the chaps in the corners writing this all down, and the Holy Spirit is dictating to Pope Gregory. Now, the only trouble with this, which gives the rise to this name that we of course still use of Gregorian chant, even though there are other forms of chant too, even in the Catholic Church. The only problem is that actually, as far as we can tell, these things weren't being written down until about 200 years later. So actually, it's a myth. No doubt that Gregory did play a part in the beginning of this idea that it would be good to conglomerate everything. But as I said, it only really happened very gradually. And it started happening in this form, roughly speaking. So here's the Jubilate Deo. And what you see is these squiggles, which are called neumes. And if you just have a look at them, you could pretty quickly tell roughly what information they're giving us. Clearly, a small splodge is likely to be one note. And then a slightly bigger splodge is going to be telling us that it's probably two notes, and we might be able to find out which direction they're going in, and so on. And then there's some slightly bigger squiggles, which are a little group of notes. However, if I asked you, even as a 10th century, 9th century monk or nun, to now sing the tune, you'd all interpret it in a slightly different way. So as far as we can tell, these neumes really start off as a kind of aide-memoire. They're not notation in the sense that you can read it off the page, and wherever you are in the world, you will sing the same thing. It's much more a way of making it slightly easier to remember. It's like, oh, you see this, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember that tune for the Jubilate, and I can follow this, and some of the pressure is off in terms of remembering the melody. But it's quite primitive. And the first big step really is to say, well, we need some sort of orientation so we know what these squiggles mean or where they exist in musical space, so to say, in terms of the pitch. So we have this single line, and it serves as a kind of pitch orientation. We go above and below the line. But as you can see, it's still quite free flowing. We still don't really know how far we're going with each step. And the hero of the hour is Guido of Arezzo. And what Guido does is he says, look, what we need is more than one line. We need two lines. And the two lines he chooses are to represent two notes in the modal scale. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of modes and scales. You know, I'm sure that what we call the scales, like the C major scale, this is not the way they thought about things in the Middle Ages and well into the Renaissance. They were thinking in terms of modes, which were really collections of 5 notes and 4 notes. And that goes to make up our modern scales. But they were thinking differently. However, that's not so important for us at the moment, because in terms of Guido's system, we can still equate it to our C major scale. If you think of the C major scale, you have 2 semitones. They're between E and F and between B and C. So Guido took those 2 notes, the F and the C, the ones with the semitone just below, and he said, right, those are my anchor points, top and bottom, and those are going to be a line, and I'm going to hang my neumes on those lines. And he soon realized that, in fact, he could use 4 lines and have even more clarity. And really, at this point, this is the modern state. Now, there's 4 lines instead of 5 lines, which we're used to. In fact, they were fairly interchangeable for a while. The 5-line stave started appearing in about the 13th century in Italy. But in fact, staves with 4, 5, and 6 lines were used as late as, say, 1600 in Monteverdi's time, fairly immaterial, because in fact, all that the extra line does is it enables us to use fewer ledger lines. The basis is here. We now know which notes we're singing, and that's the crucial thing. So we don't yet have an indication of rhythm, but we now have a very clear indication of the melodic line and how it fits with the text. So at this point, music can now start to spread and be regularized across the whole of Western Europe. And this is obviously a huge, huge step. Guido of Arezzo, not content with inventing the stave, decided that actually the notes needed naming as well. So he really was, a very, very important figure. Now, you probably know the notes as do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. In fact, T. Well, we'll go into that in a minute. It actually started as ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si. And the way he used to give the names was he used a hymn that they often sang, the Ut Queat Laxis, and he wrote a melody whereby each of these phrases began one note higher than the last. So ut starts on, let's say, C, in fact not, but let's just say it's C. And that means that the next phrase, resonare, starts one note up on the D, so re, and then mi, fa, famuli, so or sol, solve, la, and then finally you see down here Sancte Ioannis, which is a kind of combined version that becomes C. And this he used as a way of naming the notes. And suddenly now we have a sense of clarity about what we're calling each note. We know how to refer to them. And we're going to have a go at singing this little hymn, just so you get a feel for this. You'll hear in the recording that one group of singers holds the low note. And that's what I'm going to encourage you to do at your own octave. You're going to be starting on this note, which is a concert E flat if you're interested, but that's your do, and they do sing do instead of ut. Don't ask me why, but they do. So we're going to start with do, and then you're going to re, etc., etc. And you just hold that note as the hymn is being sung. It'll all make sense. Here we go.
Ut queant laxis resonare febris,
So there you are. You have become the monks and nuns of medieval Europe. You can choose your posture. You can either be kneeling. It's a rather daunting David Pipe figure at the front. You could be sitting either on the floor or indeed on chairs. You could be in COVID-safe bubbles or standing around a music stand. I rather love this little mousey in the music stand. It's rather fun. You can involve the children. Just don't go for the haircut. They'll never forgive you for that. You can involve the animals. They're all getting involved. Again, a conductor, very aggressive looking conductor, very male, if I may say so. Not a good model for the modern conductor. Just to deal with one, why ut became do. Why people put a very good syllable. Oh, my internet. I hope you can still hear me. Yeah, so people were wondering what to do about it. And in the 17th century, a guy called Giovanni Doni decided he would do something about it. And he fixed on the syllable do. It has a consonant at the front, so it's a much more grateful syllable to sing. And he insisted that he chose do as the first syllable of the word dominus. But of course, it's also the first syllable of his own name, Giovanni Doni. So thereby he ensured for himself musical immortality, a clever move. And C, in fact, was changed to T in the English-speaking world, at least, by a lady called Sarah Glover. That was in the 19th century. Anyway, that's entirely tendential to our story. So here we are, we're singing our plain chant. This is a slightly modernized version of it, but let's have a go at singing the Requiem plain chant. I've chosen plain chant that will be familiar to probably most of you through the Durufle Requiem, nowhere else, because as you know, Durufle wonderfully used all the plain chant melodies from the Requiem Mass in his own Requiem and clothed it in his own inimitable harmonies. So they're nice ways of getting into the plain chant because it's generally sing along with the monk. And again, you can just do this in your own comfortable octave. Of course, it's slightly confusing in the sense that it is written out in a way that we can sort of understand, but some of the notes are stacked on top of each other and so on and so forth. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. But let's listen to or remind ourselves of what Durufle does with the same. And please do sing along with all and every part in this recording. It may be a little bit quiet to begin with, but I hope you can hear it if you turn up a little bit or whatever. And I'm sorry that the choir in this recording is a little flat, but I'm sure you're helping them out in majestic ways and raising the pitch a bit. Let's have a go at the Agnus Dei, which is also will be familiar to many of us. It just gives us another go at deciphering the way that the plain chant's written. This one's actually a little bit easier, and it also repeats, so it's a good one. Okay, and so again, you can sing along with the gentleman in the recording. Here we go.
Agnus Dei, qui tollis
And here's what Darufle does with it. And again, please do sing along. And feel free to sing with any part. In fact, you might want to sing with the organ. Now, in any musical culture, actually, if somebody sings a melody, two things will probably happen. The first is people are going to join in. And the second thing is that they're going to start improvising ways of embellishing that melody in some way. And the most simple way you can do that, apart from just singing along with it, is to sing the same melody, but starting on a slightly different note. So maybe singing a fourth or a fifth apart and creating a sort of primitive harmonic pattern. And that's exactly what happened with plain chant, is that it started being sung in this way with more than one line. So it's the very, very beginnings of what we later would call polyphony, many voices, but it's based on one single line. And we're going to have a go at some organum, as it's called. And it was called organum because I think people thought it sounded rather like an organ. Let me just play you a little bit of an example of some organum. This is extremely authentic footage of medieval penitents.
Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem. Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem. Pie Jesu Domine, dona
Because it's thanks to Monty Python, but actually, like so much comedy, all you have to do is accurately represent what, as far as we know, actually happened. And there were groups of penitents going around various parts of Europe. In Germany here, they were called Geisellieder. In other words, whip. Geisel is a whip songs. And this was all part of this penitential mode. But for our musical purposes, this is a very good example of organum. And we're going to have a go with the Agnus Dei that we just sang. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sing Agnus Dei. I'm going to start on the G. And you can choose to either start on a C or a D. So you're either going to go that note, or you can sing on this note. Okay, so choose either that note or that note, or Lower, of course, is also possible. Okay, and then we're going to sing it together, but you will be a fourth or a fifth apart from me. Okay, here we go. That's my note. And Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona eis requiem. Fantastic. I could see that most of you were managing that brilliantly. I'm just going to give you the notes once more in case anybody was lost there. So you're either going to start on a C, that note, or a D, that note. Here we go. Here's the second line. And Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona eis requiem. And the last line. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, dona eis requiem sempiternam. Fantastic. So that's organum. And just before we leave a de Rufflet, I just wanted to point out something that may not have been obvious before, which is that de Rufflet, as well as using the plain chant melodies, also uses various, or his own versions of various medieval practices, including the organum. Now, in the Requiem, there was that bit where the sopranos and altos sang together in the Agnus Dei. And if I played that as a really like an organum together on my clunky electronic piano, it would sound something like this. He spaces that apart by one crotchet and turns it into a canon, but it's still a kind of organum canon. So you see what I mean there. Now, this is a very simple way of having two voices going on at the same time, but composers were starting, or musicians in general, were starting to be a little bit more adventurous. You will, I'm sure, have heard of Hildegard of Bingen, and she wrote lots of wonderful music. I'm not actually going to play any right now because you can easily find that and listen to some if you don't know already her wonderful hymns. I'm going to play you a little bit from a different tradition. This is actually from the Byzantine tradition, and as I said, in many ways, they are way ahead of the Western Christian tradition. And I want to introduce you to Cassiani of Constantinople, who you may not have come across before, because she was responsible for some absolutely wonderful music. And what you'll hear here is now 2 or even 3 voices occasionally, still very much mapping each other in all sorts of ways. It's not like they're completely independent. They're singing the same words at the same time, for instance. And generally speaking, the lower voice is going to be simpler and the upper voice is going to be a little bit more, maybe improvisation, a bit more adventurous melodically. But this is the next step on from that basic organum. Just have a listen to some of this.
Tus sosteras tus megalos tis ecclesias, Petron que Pavlon efemis omen, Iper Elion garellam san, en totis bis Deos vereum
It's beautiful, these beautiful melodic lines, as you can hear. In this anonymous piece, a Jubilemus, you hear a slightly different sort of development of that. The red line that you see here in the manuscript, sorry, it's a bit sort of blurry, is not a pitch thing. It's just dividing the two main voices. And I don't know if you can see my cursor as I move it, but the lower voice here is moving down in a very simple sort of scales, up, down, and then up. Whereas the upper voice, as you can immediately see, with all these notes stacked on top of each other like Black Forest Gatto, is doing something much more adventurous. And actually, it's much more improvisational. Now, we don't know whether this was, as it were, an invitation to a sort of improvisational mode of singing or a notational representation of something that would be improvised. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is that, as always, we have our simpler under melody, which relates to the plain chant, and then we have this very florid sort of descant going on top. We'll listen to a little bit of this. Our next stop is in Paris with the School of Notre Dame, known as the Ars Antiqua, and our two main friends here are rhyming, Léonin and Perrotin, and they move things on in all sorts of interesting ways. Here we're going to listen to a piece of Perrotin, and I want you to notice a number of things. First of all, we've got 3 lines of music here, okay, 3 voices, and the lowest voice, as you see going along, is essentially singing a much simpler form. It's the cantus firmus, or the original plain song line, and it's held mainly on long notes. And as you know, the Latin for to hold is tenere, and this is the origin of our word tenor, because the cantus firmus in most early polyphony was in this tenor line. It's the held line, if you see what I mean. And then 2 other voices go crazy on top, and these are very much in interaction with each other. The recording is rather wonderfully kind of wild and earthy imagination of how the singers back in those days might have sung. Of course, we don't really know, but in any way, in any case, it's a good challenge to our very sort of purified notions of what great choral singing should sound like. And just listen for one thing. As music started to be notated a bit more rhythmically, the first way that happened in vocal music was something called the rhythmic modes. And essentially what that was a kind of time signature, equivalent to a key signature. It gives you some information at the beginning of the piece. For instance, it might say, with a certain signal, it might say that the rhythm generally in this piece is going to be da 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 da. And once you have that bit of information, you can then sing the whole thing with that rhythm, basically. Then there were other rhythmic modes, and there were combinations of those modes. And that was really the first step towards actually giving each note a value. And what you hear in this music, we'll talk a little bit more about rhythmic notation, but you hear the influence of that rhythmic modal style, because a lot of the rhythms here are da, 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 as I say. Anyway, just listen to this and see if you can follow these upper parts. It's actually quite challenging, but it's fun to give it a go. And you can use this lower voice as an anchor point, because you can, it starts a bit far before it really gets going. Slightly Tarzan. So here they go. Hang in there. Well done, you made it. And that was just one word, Alleluia. So now you may find that hard to stomach. And I suppose we can be only grateful for the fact that we also have Monteverdi and Bach and everybody who came afterwards as well as our diet. But in fact, back in those days, this style of music, and obviously doesn't all sound like this, there are many, many new forms coming into play, but it was hugely impressive to those who heard it in the 12th century. And I'll just give you a moment to read this rather wonderful response to the Ars Antiqua by John of Salisbury. Over to you to have a look at this. So there you go. I don't know whether it excited more lust or devotion in you, but musicians always had to do battle with the authorities in the church because, of course, musicians, like any artists, are engaged in all sorts of different things. They want to be playful. They want to be gorgeous. They are interested in art in itself. And indeed with mathematics and many other aspects of the pure beauty of music. And it was sometimes felt that this was not really in chime with what needed to be put across theologically. And the fact that the peroton we heard was so florid, rather than focusing on the text, well, this at various points in musical history became a big theme. I want to play you now something from a little bit later, and we're starting to feel that music is becoming now more recognizable to us in terms of what we're used to. Machaut wrote the first full mass, the first mass that was really just written by one person, the Messe de Notre Dame. And he represents sort of the next stage of development. What I want you to listen out for here is that the harmony, as we're now beginning to get into this much more harmonically rich mode, nonetheless relies very much on the intervals of the fourth and the fifth, as well as the octave. And those were considered the perfect intervals in terms of chords, and those were what were allowed. The third, the humble major and minor third, which we consider to be the absolute basis of our music, was considered a dissonance and an imperfect interval because it could be either the minor third or the major third. So it's actually mainly eschewed at this point. And what you hear is this very sort of open harmony. You could even say it's quite bare. Now have a listen to that and just have this in your mind, because then the next step of the development will be a very crucial one. You see what I mean? It's got this very open feel, the harmony. And that changed. Actually, the hero is an Englishman, John Dunstable, one of the most important figures in the history of music, but one that we don't encounter so often in our own practice. That's partly because not very much of his work actually survives, although he was very successful and prolific. We're lucky that he was so successful across Europe, because that's where we find his manuscripts. We don't find any in Great Britain because of the destruction that Henry VIII wrought on our musical culture. So all the manuscripts that survive are, north and south of the Alps. But luckily we do have some, and we certainly anyway know that he was vitally, vitally important. And the reason was he decided that actually a third was a great thing. And this was considered completely radical. As I say, the third was considered a dissonance. And he was really the first. He and his cohort were the first to decide, no, this is actually a consonance and we can think of it differently. And this was a very, very radical step. It was actually given a name by all the French composers, the contenance angloise, the English face or countenance of music. It caught on immediately, and it became the basis really of all music from then on. As I say, that's really what we're used to, is what we call triadic harmony, the triad, the major or minor triad, in this case, the major triad, as the basis of our musical style. Now, when you listen to this beautiful music, you can hardly believe that this was considered highly dissonant and radical music in its time. I'm sorry to stop it there. Just to say, I will be sending a that can if you've got interest in leads, then you'll certainly be able to do that. Anyway, this gorgeous sort of lullaby-like music, as I say, was a radical step, and you can hear how it influenced composers across the continent by listening to a piece by Dufay, who was sort of the next generation, because in this piece by Dufay, you hear the soprano and the upper tenor parts. If you follow them, they're singing exactly a fourth apart. It's exactly like the organum that we sang earlier, absolutely consistently. That's, in a sense, the French style, but he adds a voice to it, which gives it this English, well, the contenance angloise, if you like, this English richness using thirds and sixths. So it's a rather wonderful example of the combination of these two different styles. all these composers were traveling widely. It wasn't unusual for a composer, if they were successful, to attach themselves to a prince or bishop. And of course, bishops in those days had a lot of worldly power. And in their company, in their train, they would go around Europe. Maybe there would be a conference deciding some article of faith. Maybe there would be a situation where peace was being negotiated. And it was this that allowed them an interchange with other composers from a long life, and traveled enormously through France, through Italy, back and forth. And as I say, he also encountered this English style. It's time really to talk a little bit about the rhythmic notation, what we call the mensural notation, which obviously is needed to create the kind of much more complex material that we've been listening to. So here we have the notes as they were first formulated, and they are familiar to us, but in a slightly different way than we're used to. Of course, for us, the breve is pretty much the longest note we're likely to encounter when we're singing, and yet it's called brief. So it was by no means the longest one. The maxima, the big one, is there. The breve was kind of medium, and the minim was considered the minimal amount that you'd have on a single syllable. So if you're going to have smaller note values, what are equivalent of crotchets, quavers, and semiquavers, they would be multiple notes on a particular syllable, if that makes sense. And these gradually developed. They started off as purely black splodges, and then they became white splodges. And in the course of time, much later, centuries later, as I say, we sort of shunted things along, and we'd stopped using the maxima and the long, and we used smaller note values until you get to Beethoven. And I encountered, actually, only a couple of years ago, I think it's in one of the Beethoven sonatas, there were notes with 5 lines across. And I thought, well, what is that? I know semiquaver, demi-semiquaver, hemi-demi-semiquaver, but what comes next? And I looked it up with great excitement to know if it was a femi or a lemmy or something like this. But to my great horror, it's just a semi. You use semi again. So it's a semi, hemi, demi, semiquaver, which I thought was terribly, terribly disappointing. Anyway, it's not relevant in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, but these are the note values that they developed. The next big figure for us is Josquin des Prés, and he had the luck, if you like, of coinciding with the invention of the printing press. And he really became the first international musical superstar because his works were so widely spread across Europe. And there you see an example of all these note values that we've been talking about here in manuscript form, and then here as it was printed. And you see straight away that the music is printed in its separate parts. So not as a score, but each individual part. And you can see there, here's the stave, you've got the notes, and you've got, each one has a clef. And the function of the clef is to tell you which note refers to which line on the stave. So the first one on the top left is the soprano clef, which meant that the lowest line of the stave was the C, so to speak. Then the next one, you have an alto clef, which the viola players amongst you will still use, the tenor clef, and so on. And the basses had a different form. They had an F clef rather than a C clef. But in any case, this is the way it was printed with each individual part. But already with Josquin, you have the sense that the way you write music also has a sort of symbolic value. And in the case of the piece, the lament he wrote for the great Ocherem, his great forebear, Nymphe des Bois, when he died, he demanded this be printed, although all music was now printed with white notes, as it were, empty notes. He wanted this piece to be printed entirely with black notes so that it would have a doleful, mournful effect on the singers who are singing it. So here's a good example of notation that doesn't make any difference to the actual value of what's being sung in terms of the note lengths and so on and so forth. It all means the same as if they were written with white notes, but it has a symbolic value. I'm actually just going to skip over that because I want to go straight to some of the clever things that Josquin started doing. He was obsessed with canons. Now, you know, of course, the canons, we've already encountered it in Duruflé, is when you have a melodic line that then follows one another, and we've all sang many canons. Josquin was particularly interested in what are called prolation canons. And what that essentially means is that you're going to have two different basically time signatures that's slightly different from time signatures, but for our purposes, they're time signatures. You can have two different ones at the front of the piece. And it means that one singer is going to sing at this speed and the other singer is going to sing at double speed. They're going to sing the same line. So here's an example of the notation is just one line, but you will actually have quite complicated polyphony resulting just from these two signals at the beginning. Have a listen to this. And Josquin was not content with just having these two voices. He wanted to do it more complicatedly. So he actually had the idea of having a canon with three different voices, but it's still one line of music. This is something that Bach later would delight in doing in his musical offering. Now, in this case, they're going to start on three different notes, a D, an A, and a higher D. And you've got these three different tempo indications. You've got the normal one, you've got the double speed, and you've got 3 times the speed. And when you write it out like this, you see how that actually happens in practice. If you see what I mean, they're kind of stretched out in different ways. But that would never have been written out for the singers this way. And somebody's helpfully done their own manuscript version for us as they sing it. So just have a listen to this. This is the 3 voices in one voice. Brilliant, clever idea. We have to remember that, of course, musicians were considered to be mathematicians in many ways, going right back to Pythagoras, who wrote a lot about music. John Dunstable was a very keen astronomer and mathematician, and many musicians were. And of course, we know composers like Bach, as well as much later composers, were fascinated by these mathematical patterns you create. What's so clever about this is not just that one line creates 3 lines, but of course that has a theological significance as well, because the Trinity is 3 in 1. So Josquin could say, well, I'm not just playing around making fun canons, I'm also making a serious theological point. So it's a highly complex art. What's common to all of these pieces as we've gone through is that there's an underpinning line, and that goes right back to the plain chant that we started with. And right through the Renaissance and polyphony that we sing more frequently, composers like Palestrina or Victoria, this plain chant line remains as the basis of music. And we're going to sing a little bit of the Victoria Requiem. So just a reminder of the Agnus Dei. Hang on, I just need to make my little thing work. Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi, etc., etc. And when we go to the Victoria Requiem in 4 voices, we have exactly that line, and it's used as the top line in regular, very simple notes. And I'm going to invite you to sing that part at whatever octave you like. You can sing one of the other parts if you prefer. It's entirely up to you, but you might just want to have the experience of singing that cantus firmus while the other lines are threading around you, if you like. So there'll be a little intonation, this first bit, and then you can join in. And of course, the riches you could draw from this very simple starting point were without end. And in fact, Vittorio wrote, as you're probably familiar with, his Requiem in 6 parts, exactly the same melody. But now the threads surrounding it are a little bit more complex. I'm now going to jump across to the secular world, because of course that was developing in parallel, and many of these composers were working in both fields, both as church composers and in the domestic sphere, in the home, usually of well-to-do families, where people would gather to make music together. Now, in the madrigal form, obviously you were responding to secular texts, and in a way, the music is often much freer. It's responding to the emotional temperature of the poetry. But here as well, you find often composers starting from a single line and threading things out from there, like a sort of blossom surrounding a single stem and a set of blossoms intertwining. And I wanted to introduce madrigal composers, a little bit less familiar to us than Monteverdi, but very much worth getting to know. Just have a listen to this and follow the top line, which is really quite extraordinary. They're singing it down a fourth, in case you're wondering why it sounds a bit low. an extraordinary chromatic line. And when you read the poetry by Petrarch, you'll see why. Just have a read of this translation. So we hear the slow, hesitant paces, but also this desolation and this feeling of desolation created by these rising semitones. Now we're going to have a go at singing that chromatic line. Again, you can do this in your own octave, and I'm going to make it harder by giving you here the original print of the cantus line. Now you'll see, first of all, the first word solo, it starts with the S over here in the picture frame. It's absolutely fine not to sing the words if it's a bit difficult to follow that, and just start on this first note, which in fact, as I say, is sounding D rather than what looks like a G. And you can just sing it to La. In fact, it might be a good idea for us to stand up. Why don't we stand up and just stretch out a bit at this point rather than getting too stuck. And just take a good breath, and you can just follow the soprano line, la, 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 all the way up. La, 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 whatever's comfortable for you. Okay, here she goes. You don't even have to look at it on the screen. You can just imagine you're in a desolate place singing this chromatic scale. Well done. And just looking at this music, what you see is not only do you only have your own part, but there are no bar lines. The bar lines that we had in the Victoria that we were singing are a totally modern invention. That wouldn't have been happening in Victoria's time, and it isn't printed here. So you're really on your own. You're in the desolate wastes that Petrarch describes, and you're on your own, and you've got to find a way of singing together. Here you are. So here's two sort of versions of that. Do take a seat if you'd like to, by the way. On the left, you see this part book where all the parts are there, a bit like we saw in the printed version of Josquin. And then on the right, maybe each person has their own part separately. But it's an interesting way of singing as an ensemble, playing as an ensemble. If you think about it these days, that's what string quartets or other groups do, in fact, what orchestras do. But we as a choir are used to singing from the score, and we can see everything that's going on, which of course is quite helpful in some ways. But maybe it caused a different level of awareness, this. You really had to understand how your part fitted with others. Here they are around a table with the scores laid out. Or you might have a big music stand that you can all use and gather around. This is in a sacred context, but you also have various group music stands used in a secular context. And if you're feeling really free about the people you're making music with, you can strip off and enjoy yourself to the full. It's worth thinking about what composers were doing, because just in the same way that singers didn't have access to a score, actually composers, it turns out, also did not compose using a score. It's almost incredible to think that when we listen to or sing this very, very complex counterpoint, very involved, actually the composers never had it in front of them all together, vertically stacked on top of each other. They couldn't see how the parts interacted with each other in that way. They would either work it out in their heads, or they would be maybe having the different parts laid out on the table. We don't really know. They were occasionally using slates, a bit like this picture of Hildegard, to work out particularly knotty bits of complex counterpoint. But it's a really extraordinary thought that none of that music, none of that polyphonic music, right into the 17th century, was written in score form, and still less published in score form. So how did they keep together? Well, what you see is that the monk in the red is using his right hand, in fact, to conduct. They didn't call it conducting, they call it giving the tactus. And they literally use those two syllables, tactus, down, up. We can all just try that. It's a very basic form of conducting. And what you find when you look at paintings of this period and Renaissance music making is that somebody is always giving the tactus. You can find it in each of these pictures I'm about to show you. And you realize that it's really in all of them. And it's quite extraordinary once you know what to look out for. So somebody is giving the tactus to help everyone along. But often, as far as we can tell, it was a personal thing. You would be doing the tactus for your own sake, just so you could know what the beat was and so you could make sure that you stayed in rhythm. Here they all are. And isn't it amazing? I mean, I never thought about this. You'd see all these paintings, you just assume they're just sort of putting their hands in the air in a dramatic way. But no, they're really helping everybody along. There she is, in the middle there. That's slightly more subtle on the left, but you can see the guy in the middle is doing it. And these enthusiastic guys on the right. I won't go into what might happen with his free hand on the top left. Best to skate over that, I think. There they are. There are a lot of pictures here. They're such wonderful pictures, but I just wanted to show you just how widespread this is in the representations of music making. There's the guy in the middle doing the tactus. And gradually a few guys, I'm afraid it was guys, according to the paintings anyway, who rolled up their music and started doing conducting. And that was the beginning of the baleful tradition of the conductor. Something which Zoom, of course, has done a great deal to wind back the clock on. Our profession is pretty much finished. But anyway, this was a development of what everybody was doing in terms of giving the tactus. So we're going to have a go at singing Now is the Month of May, and I'm sure you have your copy of the original part books. And so this is a really authentic, well, sort of, it's put through Zoom, but it's a fairly authentic way of how these madrigals would have been sung back then. And we're going to sing along with the King's Singers. And you can follow the music, and then maybe for verse 2 and 3, if it's easier to sort of put the music against the screen and follow the text as it appears on the screen, then please feel free to do that. Don't forget to do the repeats. And we'll just give it a go. Ya, da, da, do. There's your G major scale, and you just choose your part, and away we go.
Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la. Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la-la. Each with his bonny lass, upon the greeny grass, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Each with his bonny lass, upon the greeny grass. The spring glad all in gladness doth laugh at winter's sadness. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la. The spring glad all in gladness doth laugh at winter's sadness. Fa-la-la-la-la-la-la, fa-la-la-la-la-la-la. And to their bagpipe sound, the nymphs spread out their ground. And to the bagpipe sound, the nymphs spread out their ground.
Final verse.
Why then, why sit we musing? You speak delight refusing. Fa la 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 la. Fa la 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 la. Why then, why sit we musing? You speak delight refusing. Fa la 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 la. Fa la 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 la. Sitting lips and speak, shall we play body break? Fa la 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 la. Sitting lips and speak, shall we play body break? Fa la 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 la.
Congratulations. So yes, I mean, in this sort of music, obviously it's quite familiar to us. It's not so difficult to get lost, but in more complex music, people must have been getting lost all the time. And then goodness knows how they ever got started again, because it's very difficult to know where to go from. But these are just some of the mysteries of yesteryear. We are, of course, used to bar lines, but I mean, if you look at this modern print of a piece by Palestrina, and I've highlighted where the note values go over the bar lines, the bar lines would not originally have been there. And you can see this edition sort of gingerly starts putting some in to help us along, but it was only later. And that really was with keyboard music. And here's an example on the left of some music by John Bull, a great contemporary of Bird, and one of the absolutely great keyboard composers of that time for the virginals. And you see here that he uses bar lines. Why? Because keyboard music has two different lines. So in a sense, it's a score, even though it's one instrumentalist. It's a score because it's got two lines that are going together, and the bar lines help us to coordinate the two lines, essentially. By the time we get to Stravinsky jumping across the centuries there, of course, bar lines become an absolutely essential part of organizing the rhythm of music, because in this case, in every bar, pretty much, we've got a different time signature. And I'm not even going to go into all the other complex aspects of musical notation that developed in those centuries, not just bar lines, but of course, dynamics and various forms of articulation. And musical notation became ever more complex and exacting. In fact, in many ways, for some composers, especially in the late 20th century, it became too delineated things too clearly. It was became like a prison. And in fact, they wanted to break free. And what's really fun about a lot of the more wacky forms of musical notation in the later parts of the 20th century, like this sort of thing, is that in fact, it takes us back to the beginning of our story. I mean, if you just look at the bottom right-hand corner there, these squiggles are very much like the neumes that we started with in the 9th century, aren't they? It's a way of sort of freeing up music, of making it much more improvisational again, and making notation really an invitation to expression rather than necessarily an incredibly exact representation of things. Of course, it could be very exact, but it's rather fun how this story comes full circle, and there's a sense of liberation. In this case, really a liberation from the stave. Couldn't resist sending you this. I love this guy doing the gardening and chopping away these extremely unnecessary crotchets and putting on the crotchet compost heap. And these are in fact images on the top left are from Middle Ages, medieval manuscripts, but the ones on the right are a playful 20th century Russian artist having fun with the music there. To finish with, I'm going to play you a little bit of an incredible piece by Luciano Berio. Now, this really is a piece that you should experience for the first time without seeing the score. And if you're interested, I do urge you to find it on YouTube or somewhere else and have a listen to it. It's about 8 minutes long, and it's a really fantastic piece and great fun to listen to. It's really a theatre piece in many ways. And it was written for Kathy Berberian, the great singer, who interestingly also did a huge amount to bring back to life the music of Monteverdi and earlier times. So again, there's this connection between the very early and the very modern. But again, the reason I'm playing you this is because it makes these connections between the earliest forms of notation and this kind of free theatrical form of notation, often using just one line or 3 lines on a stave, and using all sorts of different forms of notation to engage the imagination of the performer. So just have a little bit of a listen to this and follow the first few pages. It starts very quietly, just to warn you, so you'll have to listen out for the tense muttering as the singer comes on stage. That's just a little taste there of Kathy Berberian doing her inimitable thing. And I love this, tense and dreamy. I think that's how we should all be when we sing. So we've reached the end of our story, really, and I hope it's given you a sense of some of the sweep of this history of our music and why things have turned out the way they are and why we look at music as we do. And as I say, it could have gone in all sorts of different directions. It's an arbitrary system that we have, but it does do an amazing job, actually, of allowing us to sing an incredible range of styles and to have a common language. And that's really what it's all about. So I hope that's been interesting and maybe opened a few avenues that you didn't yet know about. And I'm very, very happy to answer any questions you may have as best as I can. I'm going to hand over maybe to David to just sort of finish off the official part of the session, if you like. And then, yeah, as I say, anybody who wants to stay and ask me whatever you like, you're very, very welcome to.
Well, thank you, Tom. I think we decided really that anything I try and do after that will be a bit of a come down. So I think given we've done plenty of rehearsing over the last weeks, we'll end on a high with that wonderful weird Berio piece. So perhaps if I throw open the floor, if anyone's got any questions, I wonder the best way of doing this with Zoom, whether we perhaps I want to be moderator. See if I can get everyone's faces up.
If you stop sharing your screen, Tom.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that now. Hang on. Okay, that should have stopped. So, right, here I am.
There's a question from Rose that's been typed. Says, "Thanks, Tom. Do you think the vertical bar line relates to the Tacitus movement?"
Tacitus. Well, I think it originally started as, I mean, if you go all the way back to, remember the Perrotin we listened to with the kind of really weird guys doing their thing, sounding like farmyard animals. You could see there that the bar lines were really just a matter of sort of organizing chunks of music. They weren't related to kind of 4 beats or something like that. Clearly it became related to particular tactus, groupings. So, and it became therefore that each bar was a certain number of beats long. So yeah, that was certainly how it became regularized.
Anyone else?
There's another question here from Helen saying, "What is the most extraordinary piece of music you've ever conducted?"
Ooh. Well, the one that jumps to my mind is actually an amazing piece by Berlioz called Tristia. It's a grouping of 3 pieces, and at the end of it, there's a funeral march for Hamlet, and it's a mainly orchestral piece, but with this wordless chorus occasionally humming, and it's a very modern sounding piece. And at the crucial moment, you remember, now of course I can't remember the exact words that Fortinbras, you'll all be Shakespeare scholars and you'll know exactly what Fortinbras says at the end of Hamlet. But he asks for there to be a salute, a gun salute for Hamlet at the end of the play, and Berlioz actually incorporates this. So there's a kind of great dramatic orchestral climax, and then there's a great volley of rifle fire as this salute goes off. And when I did it, it was in the countryside, and we thought, well, how can we organize this? So the chap who was running it organized for a whole bunch of local huntsmen, to come along with their rifles, their air guns, I suppose they were, and they were going to be in the woods nearby. And through a complex set of conductor signals, so all the conductors who were around, we would show at the moment of truth, and there'd be this great volley of gunfire, which would be a thrilling end to the climax. Anyway, when it finally happened, we got to this grand orchestral tutti, very, very loud. I gave the signal, and in the distance you heard pop, 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 pop. And even better than that, you then heard on the roof of the place where we were rehearsing, the patter of the little pellets. And it was the most underwhelming gunfire you have ever heard in your life. And it didn't quite match the grandeur of the moment. But I think that certainly counts as one of the most extraordinary pieces that I tried to put together in a not entirely successful way, but it was very exciting.
There's another question from Rosemary. I don't know if you can see the messages, Tom.
Yeah.
And it's about if there's any way of indicating dynamics at any stage other than in words.
Not that I know of. I mean, obviously the P, F, and so on, they are shortenings of words. And as you know, I mean, they only come in quite late on, and Bach, although he occasionally used dynamics, only quite rarely. And most of the music of the Baroque period, it was just assumed you'd do your thing and be musical and work it out as a group. He generally only used dynamics in a regular sort of way when he wanted a very specific kind of contrast. So we definitely wanted it to be forte and then piano, for instance. But it was really only with the music of what we call the classical period, certainly not a word that they used, which started with Bach's sons, and then obviously Haydn, Mozart, and later Beethoven and so on, where music becomes much more about dramatic blocks. It's much more about telling a sort of dramatic story with very clearly articulated sentences. And at that point, your dynamic gradations become super, super important. And that's really the point at which dynamics became absolutely de rigueur and everybody was using them. And yeah, again, it's a case of the notation following the needs of the music, but then influencing the music. So when you get to Beethoven, you almost get the sense that the fact that he could write sforzando actually inspired him to write music with much, much more emphatic rhythmic energy, and you see him scratching out sforzando, sforzando, sforzando on every single bar, sometimes on the offbeats. So again, this goes hand in hand with each other.
Thank you.
Fascinating to see all those lovely manuscripts, Tom, and the way even Perotin written it out, and then I suppose you mentioned with Dupré and the printing press. It's quite a labour of love, I guess, to even write those out and have so many parts without the luxury of a photocopier or CPDL to do downloads.
Well, indeed. Yes, and of course, and that's a reason why music, you didn't have scores. Music was written in the most efficient possible way, and you would just get your own part, because paper or parchment, certainly when they were being written out, was just far too expensive. So yes, I mean that's also why printing was so important, and then the invention of paper as in a relatively cheap form allowed that to broaden in scope. But yes, manuscripts were extremely precious things. But let's not forget that most music making, just as most music making today across the world, is done entirely without any musical notation. So it's free as the wind. You can make your instruments, if you have instruments, out of bits of animal bone or various plants, or you can sing, you can make drums, whatever it may be, and you don't necessarily need to write it down. And there are all sorts of extremely complex traditions I'm not just talking about obviously the Indian tradition or the gamelan tradition, but all sorts of folk music. So you listen to a gospel choir, they're improvising complex harmonies, and it's all done without writing anything down. So in many ways, our version of thinking about music is an anomaly.
It's a nice segue. You said that. There's a question here from Bill Hambry, if I can read it out. I'm interested in the idea of notation being a prison. Was Stravinsky the only composer who combined breaking free with popularity in modern times?
Okay, well, it slightly depends what you mean by breaking free. But if he means by breaking free, certainly of the kind of everything has to be 4/4 or 3/4. No, I think there have been other composers, because of course we think of complex rhythms, not just from something like The Rite of Spring, but certainly jazz had a huge influence. Now, again, jazz is essentially a non-notated musical tradition, but many composers were hugely excited about jazz. You think of composers like Stravinsky or Ravel and others, Poulenc in the 1920s and 30s being influenced by jazz. And then, of course, the entire American tradition, Copland and Bernstein and all the others. It was, that was part of their absolutely their musical tradition. And in order to notate jazz rhythms at all successfully, or dance rhythms, Latin dance rhythms, as Copland became very interested, you have to be quite playful with your notation, and certainly your rhythmic notation. So I would say that was actually, in many ways, the music that we think of as being extremely popular, like dance music or South American music. You certainly wouldn't say that was esoteric, but when you notate it, you have to notate it in quite complex ways. So it's certainly not, you can have both.
Thank you. Wonderful. Has anyone else got any more questions? I feel like I'm doing my Fiona Bruce here. Or... No? Well, I think if no one's got any other questions, just leaves us to thank you hugely, Tom, for such a fascinating and illustrative, in all ways, musically and visually, evening you've given us. It's so much food for thought, and a wonderful way of having Derufle Requiem, which we know so well. Perhaps we didn't realize that so much of that was actually, can I call it early music for lack of a better phrase, couched in these wonderful harmonies and orchestrations. And it's fascinating to see that on the page.
Yeah, well, as I say, it's really one thread, and that's the wonderful nature of artistic traditions, and especially it's true of music, is that those threads run through the whole story. And that's really what I wanted to emphasize today, is that so much of what we do now is rooted in that story of 1,000 years of music making.
And do you want to give your project one little plug? You mentioned in the email correspondence, if I've called it the right word.
Yeah, well, it's just I'm doing this as part of a project that I started a few years ago called 5 Senses Music. We do a whole range of things. Actually, mainly they're events, and I do concerts where I try to combine the experience of music making, live music making, often with a big orchestra, with explaining things, but in a way that I hope is accessible and in a way that's based very much in the music itself. And most of our events, we have people come and sit, whether they're families or we do events just for adults, where they're coming and sitting right inside the ensemble, and experiencing music in that very up close kind of way. So yeah, if you've got time, I'll send you the website link, but it's 5sensesmusic.org. And you can see some of the projects that we've been up to. Obviously, it's been a bit of a hiatus in the last year. But yeah, I decided to do this talk sort of to support 5 Senses Music. And yeah, be delighted if you go there or join our mailing list, and if you're interested in what we're up to.
Thank you. Wonderful. That sounds great too. Well, I think everyone, 13 minutes early, I hope no one's going to complain, but what a lovely way to end. So thank you again, Tom, for giving us such an entertaining and informative evening. And do hope when we come out of lockdown, all goes well with your 5 Senses Music.
Thank you. And lovely to meet you all. It's very nice to see you all singing away there. And yeah, best of luck with everything if we ever emerge from this situation. But it's a great pleasure to at least be able to join you, even though I'm far away. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. So you're all welcome to go, everyone, or any questions you like afterwards. Chat room.
Great. Thanks so much, and I'll leave you there.